They didn't ride into dime novels or fade into romantic legend. Their names weren't etched into school books or whispered in saloons with the reverence reserved for Jesse James or Billy the Kid. And yet, in the dust-choked reaches of the American frontier, where survival blurred the lines between law and lawlessness, these women carved paths as jagged and defiant as any outlaws. They were not bystanders in history. They were history's renegades, shaped by hardship and driven by something deeper than rebellion, necessity, vengeance, desperation, or the hunger for freedom no marriage or moral code could contain. The year was 1865. The Civil War had ended, but the nation's wounds gaped open. Railroads crept westward like steel serpents, displacing buffalo, natives, and decency. In Texas, a girl named Belle Shirley came of age in a world that measured a woman's worth by her obedience and her dowry. But Belle had other plans. Educated, sharp-tongued, and fearless, she married a man named Sam Starr, an outlaw by both trade and temperament. Together they rode into Indian Territory, joining forces with Cherokee desperados and rustlers who skirted the very edges of America's reach. Belle Starr, so the press would later call her, was not merely a woman in a gang. She was its orchestrator, its velvet-gloved general, dressed in black velvet and plumed hats, brandishing a Colt like it was a fan. Her crimes weren't mere thievery. They were defiance in silk. She bribed judges, sweet-talked marshals, and vanished into the folds of Indian Territory whenever justice came too close. And when she died, murdered with her back turned and her saddle barely warm, the papers printed her legend with relish. But behind the flair and fantasy was a woman who outlived husbands, outwitted lawmen, and refused to live meekly in a man's world. Northward, across the Kansas plains, another woman's story took root in harsher soil. The details of her early life are threadbare, as if history itself recoiled from her. But her legend would grow from whispers and wanted posters. Cattle rustler, horse thief, murderer. Her name was Laura Bullion. And though she rode with the infamous Wild Bunch, Butch Cassidy's crew, her story remained in the shadows. She dressed as a man when it suited her, worked scams with as much charm as menace, and disappeared just as quickly when bullets flew. They called her the Thorny Rose, a name both cruel and poetic, for she was beautiful and brutal in equal measure. The newspapers preferred her as a cautionary tale, a fallen woman seduced by danger, but those who rode with her knew better. She was no one's victim. When she was finally captured in 1901, she was carrying forged banknotes, stolen weapons, and enough aliases to fill a ledger. She spent years in a Tennessee prison, then re-emerged as someone else, an old woman in Memphis, forgotten, unclaimed by the history she helped write. Farther west, in the dry gulches of Arizona and New Mexico, a darker figure rode the horizon. Pearl Hart. A Canadian by birth and a wanderer by nature, Pearl grew up yearning for adventure and aching with dissatisfaction. She fled home as a teenager, married a gambler, and then left him, then returned, then left again, each time closer to the brink of outlawry. Her final descent came in 1899 when she and a drifter named Joe Boot staged a stagecoach robbery near Globe, Arizona. The crime was clumsy and brief. They stole a few dollars and some personal items before being apprehended days later. But it was the image that haunted the public. A woman, dressed in men's clothing, wielding a pistol, and robbing the very symbol of frontier civilization. During her trial, she charmed reporters, quoted Shakespeare, and declared she did what she must to survive. Her words rang louder than her bullets ever had. Sentenced to prison, she became a media spectacle, a morality tale for some, a folk hero for others. She was eventually pardoned by the governor, not for remorse, but for being a lady. And yet, even in release, she never rejoined society. Her final years are a haze. One version has her running a cigar store. Another says she disappeared into the desert. History, ever fickle, let her fade. And then there was Cattle Annie and Little Britches, girls barely out of childhood, chasing dreams forged from pulp novels and broken promises. They came from Oklahoma's plains in the 1890s, drawn to the outlaw life not by poverty alone, but by the mythos of the men who rode before them. Dressed in buckskins and armed with revolvers, too large for their hands, they rode with the Jennings gang, stealing horses and warning bandits of approaching posses. But unlike their male counterparts, their rebellion was layered with tragedy. Little Britches, born Jenny Stevenson, was abandoned by her father and married off by 13. Cattle Annie, or Anna Emmeline McDoulet, was drawn into crime after a troubled childhood. Their spree was short-lived. Arrested by legendary lawman Bill Tilghman, they were sent to reform school and promptly erased from the pages of official history. Yet their brief blaze across the prairie echoed louder than the lives they returned to. They had dared to become the stories they had once read, if only for a moment. Not all of these women rode with gangs. Some rode alone. Some didn't ride at all, but plotted in shadows and silence. Take Rose Dunn, the so-called Rose of the Cimarron. At just 15, she was involved with George Bitter Creek Newcomb, a member of the Wild Bunch. Though debate still shrouds her involvement, witnesses say she stood in a hail of bullets to tend his wounds. Others insist she fired back at U.S. Marshals, defending him to the last. After his death, she vanished into civilian life, married a politician, and never spoke of the days she was hunted. In that silence was something profound, not shame, but a refusal to let others narrate her myth. These women were not outlaws in the romantic sense. They were not Robin Hoods or revolutionaries. They were often reckless, sometimes cruel, always complicated. Their crimes were real, their choices often grim. But to judge them by the same standards as the men who robbed trains and shot sheriffs would be to miss the point. They were reacting to a world that offered them few options and even fewer freedoms. A world where violence was the language of survival and respect was earned only through defiance. The frontier was no place for delicate souls, and so they shed delicacy like a corset too tight to breathe. Their lives did not fit neatly into the moral narratives of the day. They were branded sinners, degenerates, and monsters. But in truth, they were mirrors held to a nation still learning how to define womanhood. In their defiance, they exposed the fragility of the systems that sought to contain them. And while their names may not linger in textbooks or monuments, their legacy survives in the tension between myth and memory. The West was not just won by men with six-shooters and steely gazes. It was shaped by women who refused to stay behind, who burned through the prairie like fire through dry grass, bright, uncontained, and unforgettable. Their stories remind us that history is not always written by the victors. Sometimes it's written in the margins, in outlaw ballads and whispered names, in the footprints left behind by those who refused to walk the road they were given. History rarely leaves room for those who lived in its shadows, but today we stepped into the dust they left behind. The women who rode hard, broke rules, and refused to be forgotten. If their stories stirred something in you, if you felt the weight of their choices, the fire of their defiance, then let their memory ride a little further, like this video, so others might find these forgotten legends. Subscribe to walk deeper into the untamed corners of our past, and leave a comment below, because history is still being written, and your voice is part of the story.